Hey there, welcome back for another podcast on Soulwidth. I'm pretty excited today. Long time coming. I've got Alex de Jersey, a PhD candidate at Tasmanian School of Medicine, and Hayley Charlton Howard, a marine biology researcher and member of the Adrift lab. And together, they're part of a powerful movement helping to redefine our understanding of plastic pollution, which is been a very big topic of late. It's something that caught my attention almost more than a year ago. So the reason that your research actually got my attention originally, by the way, I go off topic all the time, so make sure you get me back on topic, is that I know it's already happening. Do you guys listen to the Diary of a CEO? No. Okay, so Diary of a CEO is a big podcast that I like to listen to, and they were talking about how the amount of plastic that we're digesting ourselves from all these places of like storage and animals and all this other aspect. And they were saying that we have like a plastic spoon in our head lodged in our brain. Yeah, I know. And that we consume almost a credit card size of plastic a week. And I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sensitive. So that night I couldn't sleep. I just could not sleep at all. Okay, I'm going to introduce you guys now. Thank you so much for that. So we have Alex here, and we also have Hayley. So say hi, Hayley.
Hello.
Alex, yep. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is going to be such an interesting podcast. And I guess, because this is my first time interviewing two people at the same time. So just jump in, and if you got something to say, just say it. But I'd really like to just start off and just get a little piece of information from both of you. Normally we start this podcast with what are the words that sort of got you here? What's the moment that sort of got you to this space where you started to do the research that you're doing and you're working in the line of work that you're working? Hayley, did you want to start?
Yeah, sure, I'll go. So there's not really one event that comes to mind that sort of has brought me into the plastic space. It was more just about the fact that I've been really lucky enough to grow up by the water. I have a very environmentally, scientifically minded family, so it's kind of what I was raised with. But definitely going for, walks on the beach with my mum and seeing plastic washing up everywhere from a young age, it really inspired me to sort of understand what I could about this topic, and then in my later years towards environmental conservation and really addressing this plastic issue.
Yeah. And Alex, your focus was on pathophysiological effects of the microplastics. Did I say that right? Or did I?
Yeah, you smashed it. No, you got it. No, you got it completely.
Yeah. And so tell me, how did you end up in this space? Because I think it's just such a unique space to research, but more than that, like being influenced at such a young age to go where you're going. How did you end up here?
Well, my first taste into research was during my master's, and I was working on the diet of seabirds, which was a really fun project. I was playing with poo and, using DNA to work out what prey they'd been eating. But as I was doing that, kind of realized that the stuff that we should be interested in, which is chemicals and plastics and pollutants, they don't have a DNA signature. So I wasn't able to pick up on that really important element of diet. And so that kind of got me researching, who is researching this sort of stuff. And I came across Jen in this lab and was really inspired to get involved. And she had an amazing collaboration with my primary supervisor, who's Jack Orty. And so it's this beautiful blend of, I'm now in medical research, which is crazy, and doing a little bit more into what the health consequences are of this plastic that they're consuming.
So you said it had no DNA. What did you mean by like there was no research around it?
Well, in using DNA, it's really difficult to pick up on things that are pollutants. Just that sort of technique. You'd have to use a different technique in the lab in order to detect different pollutants that are present through scat analysis. So the way in which I was researching diet was quite limited in terms of interpreting chemical pollution.
Yeah, okay. So Hayley, I got to hear in my notes that you coined the term plasticosis. Is that correct? Plasticosis. Is that true that you coined that term in your honours research?
Yes, yeah. So it was kind of a brainchild of a bunch of different Adrift lab members. We were seeing this pathology, very, very heavy fibrosis or scarring in a lot of our samples. And sort of through my literature review, we realized that a lot of this pathology and plastics was acting in a very similar way to other types of diseases we might be more familiar with. So something like asbestosis and silicosis. So if you've heard of, asbestos dust or silica dust, how that's causing a lot of issues in terms of lung scarring and fibrosis. Basically, the reason that is, it's just a foreign particle that's inside the body's tissues that it can't get rid of. So over time, as that particle causes injury, the body wraps it in a layer of scar tissue, which over time sort of takes over the tissue and becomes fibrotic. So we realized that plastics were kind of
Right, sorry, what's fibrotic mean? Just like a
fibrotic,
fiber?
just very, very scarred, heavily scarred tissue.
Yeah, okay.
So scarring's a natural healing process. It helps support the tissue while it's sort of recovering. But over time, because scar tissue is inflexible and it doesn't really have a function specific to whatever organ you're looking at. So for example, if you have scarring in the lungs, that scar tissue isn't able to transport different gases across membranes like lung tissue is supposed to. So it doesn't really serve much of a purpose other than support. So if an organ becomes fibrotic and overrun with scar tissue, it loses a lot of its function. So basically what we found is that plastics were acting in a similar way to silica dust or asbestos in that they were just a foreign particle the body couldn't get rid of. And over time, it was causing this similar fibrosis to asbestosis and silicosis. So in line with that sort of naming convention, we called it plasticosis because plastic was causing the fibrosis.
Yeah, okay. So what you're saying is that when the plastic's in there, that the organ wraps around it? Like it sort of like envelopes it and then it can't get out. Is that what you're saying?
So kind of the plastic will be embedded into the tissue at some point, or if it's repeatedly interacting with the tissue and causing injury, then the body will launch an immune response against it. And part of that immune response and the damage caused will produce scar tissue as a result.
What's the biggest concern in terms of impact of plastic getting digested that you've observed in seabirds and in wildlife? Because I remember the article was mainly focused on seagulls. So is it just seagulls or is it all sort of wild ocean life?
So for my article particularly and Adrift Lab's focus, we like to focus on the shearwaters. So kind of similar to a seagull, but a petrel species, so a tube nose, a sort of a big brown seabird that feeds offshore mainly. So that's kind of our focus species. In terms of the most concerning impacts of this particular plastic ingestion, it's covering a wide range of negative impacts. Anything from the basics of plastics in the digestive tract can cause blockage. It can cause things like starvation, where if an animal has a stomach full of plastic, it reads as if it's full, so it doesn't feed. But obviously the plastics don't have any digestive value, so they can become quite malnourished and starve.
So it doesn't know that it's hungry?
It doesn't know that it's hungry, no. That was a really early study that was done sort of looking into plastic ingestion, was just the simplicity of if there's plastics in a stomach, it makes the stomach feel heavy and full. So it doesn't send a response to the brain that it actually needs to feed. But then once those plastics are in the digestive tract, because they're often sharp and brittle, they can cause injury through poking and prodding and stabbing and tearing, which can cause issues down the line. And a lot of those are sublethal impacts as well. So we might not be able to get a read on if for example, a seabird is heavily impacted by plastic until it's already too late. So those are the more obvious ones. But then Alex's research and then my supervisor Jack's research was sort of untangling the more subtle impacts of things like when plastic is ingested by these seabirds, it changes their blood chemistry. It can find its way into tissues, not just the stomach, but a lot of other organs. And it can cause many, many other impacts, which I think Alex will touch on with her.
Yeah, Alex. So, Hayley, that was awesome. So it seems like, did you investigate your research, Hayley, in one of the areas that you just said? And Alex, did you do something that's slightly different, but also sort of coincide?
Yeah, so we work on the same species, but then Hayley follows more on histology of the tissue, and then I'm looking more at a subcellular level, so looking at things like proteins and genes that are responding to whatever's happening within the stomach or in response to the plastic. But I guess to answer your question, I think Hayley's kind of right in the sense that the most, severe impact that we witness is the lethal consequences. I've been fortunate enough to go to the island now for 4 years in a row, and seeing the amount of birds that are like really small from this starvation is really challenging, and it's upsetting to see that's the really visceral feeling of just knowing, I guess, how many birds are suffering from that. And it's not really until I bring my samples back and start processing them in the lab, because I work with birds that are of a healthy weight, that are leaving the island and looking really good. They're of a healthy weight, they've got great wings, and they're ready to take on their migrations. Not until I come back into the lab and do my analysis that I start to really feel the weight of those sublethal consequences and what that could mean for the birds that have done their migration.
Are you saying that this effect is having an impact on the time that they migrate and if they migrate at all?
In a sense, yes. So there are birds that are really small, which do not have the muscle or the strength to get off the island or even to begin that first flight. And so Hayley's work focuses on those birds. Those are really underweight and malnutritioned. But then there are birds that are of a healthy weight that do have plastic in them. And so I'm trying to understand, what's the burden of living with that plastic load? And my work has kind of shown that it seems to just be a ticking time bomb, that all the odds are not in their favour. They've got really serious health consequences, but it's challenging because these birds, they begin their migration and they go off and live offshore for 5 years until they're ready to come back and breed. And so it's really difficult. There's like a large window of time where we're not able to work with those birds until they come back as an adult. So what happens in that time is becoming difficult to research, but kind of where we're trying to understand what's happening in that time frame.
Is it an ethical aspect of why you can't do the research, or is it just because they're not locally there?
Yeah, they're just not locally there. It's actually quite technically challenging. They're across the whole world, basically. So it can be really difficult to find and track them. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So this is huge. So it seems like it has a big domino effect, not just to how they exist in this life that they are currently living and forming, but it seems like it's a spreading aspect to potentially eliminate birds to some capacity, these birds to some capacity, if they're not able to migrate, if they're not able to breed.
Yeah, it's definitely a risk to their conservation.
So what's the bigger effect on that it has between the elimination of them and how it sort of impacts the environment? Because I'm just, coming from a very naive point of view here, I would imagine that their effect on the environment is also impacted to some capacity. Would that be fair enough to say, or is that just, yeah? And I guess, Hayley, Alex just mentioned before about a different sort of area of research that you were doing. Can you go into a little bit more detail about that, please?
Yeah, of course. My broad focus for my research and my background, I come from a marine conservation, marine biology, zoology standpoint. But in order to get the answers that we needed, I needed to sort of dip my toe into the world of medicine. So specifically the field of histology, which is looking at sort of the function and structure of tissues. So what I basically did was I had to read up very quickly, and I was lucky to have a lot of mentors in that sort of medicine field bringing me into the fold. So basically all we did is that we had the Adrift lab team on Lord Howe Island, which Alex mentioned, a really, really amazing field team that does all of the emotional heavy lifting of collecting these samples for me. So they found birds that were either already deceased or unfortunately had to be euthanized because they were just so weak and would never make it. And what they did was they collected the proventriculus for me, so basically the bird's stomach. And what I did was basically chop them into really, really fine pieces so that they could fit on a slide, and I stained them with some histological stains. And these stains are kind of like food dye that will bind specifically to different things. So I was looking particularly at collagen, because collagen and sort of that connective tissue is what forms scar tissue. And for whatever reason, it stains bright blue with the particular stain that I was looking at. So I was taking these stomach tissues, I was processing them, staining them, and then looking them under a microscope to see what damage I could find. Yeah, definitely. If the glowing blue wasn't enough. But basically, I wish I had a photo here I could show you, but Along the stomach wall, you have your digestive glands, and imagine them as sort of rows of sausages all stacked next to each other. And these folds are what basically produce digestive fluids and allow for, the stomach to do what a stomach does. But in the really, really damaged stomachs, unfortunately, a lot of those long linear structures were completely either shorn away, so non-existent, or were completely abnormally shaped or very damaged. And then, of course, there was scar tissue. So usually there's a little bit of underlying connective tissue along the stomach wall. It helps it to keep its shape. But in the cases of birds with what we call plasticosis, the scar tissue was basically covering the entire digestive gland. So it's probably going to reduce the function of that digestive gland, if it even exists at all in the stomach tissues.
Yeah, okay. So you were witnessing stomachs that were completely, like they had inside with just total scar tissue.
Yeah, you could still identify some structures, so you could still see where the epithelial wall was, you could still see where the muscle underneath was, but yeah, they were pretty much balls of scar tissue, which is quite horrific.
So, and just going back a little bit when you were saying that you were putting the dye on it, is there any other aspect that it could have been besides plastic? Is it sort of definite when you put that dye on that it can only be that? Is there other things that it could have been?
Yeah, so we did investigate that. So the birds will also naturally ingest pumice, similar to sometimes how birds will pick up small rocks and eat them, and the rocks will help them grind up hard things in their stomach. So, for example, seabirds will naturally consume pumice to help them break down hard things like fish bones and squid beaks and that sort of thing. So we did find some pumice in the stomach, but we found that there was no relationship no sort of statistical relationship between pumice and the damage we were seeing, but we saw a really, really strong correlation between the amount of plastic and the amount of damage. So unfortunately, it's sort of this game of statistics where statistically we were seeing evidence that it was plastic related, but then you also had to take a step back and look at it from a biological standpoint. These birds, along the evolutionary pathway, they've been ingesting things like pumice for thousands and thousands of years. It has helped them sort of digest food through their evolutionary process. So if pumice was causing this damage and causing these birds to experience these sublethal impacts and potentially mortality, it wouldn't have evolved as a behavior. So it's just sort of, you don't want to assume that it's plastic, but there's two lines of evidence, both statistically and biologically speaking, that points to plastic being the main culprit of this.
Yeah, wow. So, Alex, can you tell us about the sort of challenges of blending the ecological research with the biomedical methodologies that you use, and
I guess take a step back and explain
yes.
what it is I do, and then how in which we face challenges in doing that.
That'd be great.
So we wanted to work with, birds that appear really physically healthy, but birds can't tell you what's wrong or where hurts or any of that sort of stuff. And so we were really, starting with the basics and just kind of like a human. If something's wrong, can't really put your finger on it, but you're just, feeling
it's like
a bit
baby or something, hey, isn't it?
Yeah, you would take it to the doctor, and usually the doctor would start with, really a blood panel or a blood test to sort of start to understand, where things are going wrong, how your body's responding. And so we did something really similar with the birds. And we wanted to look at proteins in particular, because if there's basically anything happening in your body, proteins are facilitating that. So if you're digesting food, we'll see a lot of digestive proteins. If you're responding to an infection, we'll see an immune response set of proteins, and they all have their own role within the body. And depending what's up, what's down, it's a really great tool to sort of understand what's happening within your body. Now, the challenge with that is that in order to know what proteins are in the sample, you have to know what proteins are in the birds.
Yeah, okay.
And so that was kind of our biggest hurdle, is that these birds haven't been sequenced before in any way. There's no reference genome or proteome or anything like that. So that was our first big hurdle, is trying to work out, we've got these samples, can we do protein work on them? And the great thing with proteins is that they're really highly conserved across taxa. And so their proteins are actually really similar to our proteins, but there are other bird species that have got these references. And so we were able to map just based on what conserved proteins there are across evolutionary trees, which is awesome.
Yeah, okay. So in that space, you were talking about the proteins. So, and you sort of touched on immunity. So with these proteins, I would imagine that they're in their gut and they're helping them stay healthy.
Mm-hmm.
Touching on what Hayley was saying before about the scar tissue just overlapping and just taking over the inside of the stomach, does that mean that they're more likely to fall ill as well and get sick?
Yeah, once you're in a compromised immune state, you're definitely more susceptible to things because your body's kind of giving it everything. But we haven't really quantified that in the birds. But from a biological point of view, it does make sense.
So one thing as well that you're asking about in terms of like infection potentially, for example, in the stomach, if we're seeing birds with compromised stomachs, you have a lot of food coming in that could potentially be covered in pathogens. So for example, if your stomach is compromised and you can't produce acidic digestive fluid, that acidic fluid also helps in preventing infection through the digestive tract. So if you have compromised digestive glands that can't produce that acid, then you might be more likely to get sick, for example.
And were you finding that a lot of birds were getting more sick? I mean, it doesn't seem like you had any sort of like history of research to sort of compare. So is it a difficult question to answer?
Yeah, we haven't been able to answer that one yet.
Yeah, okay.
The birds can't really tell you, and they don't really get like colds and things like that. So there's no real visible signal for us to
Is
determine.
there any sort of disease that they're starting to get that they really shouldn't be getting?
Not that we've seen. We're mainly focusing on the pathologies and the diseases like Hayley's been quantifying. And we're definitely seeing more and more pathologies as the years go on, and they're increasingly eating more plastic.
Yeah, okay. So like to take it back to humans, because, you know, we're pretty selfish. What's the long-term effects that the microplastics could have on our health? And is it something that seeps over into other wildlife and things like that? Like, is this sort of like telling us what could happen to other species as well?
For sure. I think especially in my work, that's the great thing about proteins, is that the signals we're detecting could actually be applicable to any species because we're using proteins that are so well conserved. So I think that there's great implications for species that consume such a large amount of plastic, so things like turtles or other marine species. And I would love for ecologists to see this and, realize that it is possible through collaboration, that ecologists have to wear so many hats, and, adding medical research into that is a bit scary, or veterinary research is a bit scary, but there's tools and collaboration and things like that. So I hope that other research groups are, excited or, can see the different things that they could research within their wildlife species. But in terms for humans, it's really challenging to start to work out what the impacts of plastic are, simply because there are so many confounding variables. We've got a really long lifespan and other things at play, like a lot of air pollution and chemical pollution and diet and all the rest of it. That's why these birds are such an amazing study species, because we work on chicks that have been underground and being fed by plastic by their parents, and so there's very little other variables at play, and so it's a really unique circumstance where we can start to really pick apart the effects of plastic. But I guess part of our work is showing the different signatures that you can see that are resulting from plastic, and then moving forward, we can start to look for those signals within humans.
So if you were to like look at a human stomach and you were to put that dye on that you were talking about, Hayley, before, is that one way to test to see how much plastic we consume or something like that? Is that just me just being absolutely naive, or?
Yeah. So the differences between people and our sable shearwaters that we're studying is that they're largely consuming what we call macroplastics. So large pieces of plastic that are visible, you can pick them up, you can hold them, you can, in most cases or in some cases, identify what it is. So for example, a bottle cap. The plastics that have been found in people are very, very different. So they're on a much smaller scale. So things that are like microplastics, that term's been co-opted a little bit, but in science, a microplastic is basically anything between the ranges of 1 micron to 5 millimeters. So really, really small. And even smaller than 1 micron. So roughly smaller than a bacterial cell. So really, really small. And so these are the plastics that have been largely found in human tissues. So that sort of plastic has been found in our blood, in our brains, and in our reproductive organs. So what we're seeing in terms of, if you were to, for example, as you said, cut open a human, put a histological dye on it, you'd probably see slightly different pathologies where you'd see small fragments of tissue largely embedded, small fragments of plastic embedded in tissue, as opposed to these big sweeping macroplastics. And it's really important to note as well that especially with humans, this field of plastics and the impacts on health is really, really new. It's only started in the last sort of 5 years or so. So I think it's really important to draw these parallels to engage people and get them to care, because if people who aren't so environmentally inclined hear that there's plastics in birds, they might not care. But if they hear there's plastics in people, they might suddenly take it to heart and think, oh, this is impacting me. But I think because it's such an emerging field of study, we do need to let it breathe a little bit and be careful to be true to the science and not try to scare people too much. We still don't really know what's happening, but from the parallels that we can draw from other studies, from wildlife, from lab studies, it's not likely to be a good story.
So the similarities between the sort of neurodivergent conditions of like Alzheimer and Parkinson's, is there relations to your studies that you found and also those sort of diseases that could shift and sort of enlighten people to understand that, you know, we need to be a little bit more careful with what we're doing, both for the birds and for us? Either Alex or Hayley, however you want, really. Yeah, go,
yeah,
Alex.
I think so.
Yeah.
It's challenging because the references that we use to pick up things like that, like the Alzheimer's signatures and stuff like that, is based on a pool of research. And so a lot of the interest has been in stuff like that. But it's not like we're saying that Alzheimer's is in these birds. We're just seeing evidence of cognitive decline. And the protein patterns that we're seeing are similar to those seen in patients with cognitive decline in diseases such as Alzheimer's and things like that. But we can absolutely take something. I'm more of a bird person, and so I think I'm hoping it inspires people to take plastic pollution a bit more seriously, even if, you know, it's an offshore problem, they're not seeing it. But it is having great impacts to these birds that none the wiser.
There's some pretty graphic images that have been circling the internet that I've been seeing of late, you know, sort of in preparation for having the conversation with you guys, that it's very evident that there was one photo and the plastic was just really all coming out of his bum, and it was just like it was like a garbage tip or something like that. And just that image within itself got me to sort of realize, and it's a bit interesting to how, you know, you start researching something and something goes into your brain and then you start seeing it everywhere. And then I was talking about that interview that I saw the other week on the Diary of a CEO. After I saw that interview, and with everything that I've been talking with you guys, I actually was looking at my takeaway food, how it has that sort of like, you know, Chinese food, plastic there, looks like really soft plastic, and it's sort of like it gets all moistured. Is that the microplastic that you were talking about that we ingest? Because it's just like the plastic's so melted and the food is so hot. And when the food's in there for a while, does that mean it seeps into the food?
Yeah. And I think a good example is like if you've got a chopping board and it's full of scratch marks, you know,
Yes.
how you can start to see it divoting, and then people that are like heating up their lunch or whatever in Tupperware containers that also have lots of scratches on the bottom of it. I think they're kind of clear signs that you've generated some sort of microplastic or plastic that you can't see because you can see where it was.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
And it's similar as well to, like, there was a study that came out that was assessing the amount of microplastics generated by steeping one plastic tea bag in a cup of boiling water. So even the boiling water starting to eat away at that tea bag generated, I think it was thousands and thousands of microplastics per cup of tea, or nanoplastics.
And then we're digesting that, and some of it doesn't go through, or does it none of it go through?
Most of it will go through. The smaller particles are able to be absorbed by the digestive tract and translocated or moved around via the bloodstream. We don't know what percentage of that sort of gets turned over, but plastics can enter the body through the digestive tract. Also, a very common source of it is household dust. So when we're breathing in, there's microplastic particles and nanoplastic particles that are suspended in the air. Anytime you dust something, you're probably breathing in plastics. and it can be transported across your lung membrane. But those are the very, very small particles. And again, we're still not quite sure how frequently that's occurring.
Yeah, okay. So sorry, you just totally blew my mind then, because I was just cleaning yesterday and I was actually just thinking this, well, I was thinking about the dust going into my body, but you're saying that there could be fine pieces of plastic that could go in our body. In terms of sort of like seeing what it's done to the birds and seeing how it affects them, like I would imagine that like having some sort of effect on us in terms of our mood, in terms of our immune system, because you were saying before that it could affect their immune system. So for us to digest it, can you assume that it would affect our immune system? Do you know any studies or information about that? Either of you, Alex, I guess?
No. Yeah, in humans, it's just really challenging because there's so many variables, and it's not just plastic that we're exposed to, there'd also be like petrol particles and all other sorts of things in our dust and in our environment. And so picking apart the impacts of plastic on us in isolation to the other pollutants that we're exposed to is really challenging. But I think pollutants as a whole will definitely be having impacts to our overall health.
So you were saying before, Alex, that you really care about the birds and, you want to make an impact on them. What's the sort of like, in terms of insights for policymakers and the public, do you think the best way to help the birds is to have the research coincide with the effects on us? I know, like a lot of people. Here's the thing: like I live just near Torquay, and you can always tell the difference between someone who lives in the area and someone who's visiting, because sometimes they'll just leave shit everywhere. And it's just really, really frustrating. And you see stuff on it's frustrating. So for these people who don't live in the area, they sometimes just don't give a shit, or they're not there long enough to give a shit. What's the sort of message that we need to start getting across to people?
Yeah, I think I can resonate with that because I see people, littering and they're not realizing how easy it is for that to end up in our ocean. And they're not really aware of, I guess, the consequence that has. As someone that's seen firsthand endless times birds dying with plastic that I recognize in the street, like that's something that I found really difficult because you just want to go up and shake them and be like, if only you knew what that was going to end up doing. But I think, a part of it being with Adrift Lab, we're really inspired and we always collaborate with different artists or mediums, whether it's through podcasts or, paintings or photographers or films. We're trying to get the message out and help people to connect with their story and, hopefully inspire them to make that change at home. Or I don't even believe that it's really of an individual level. Like, of course, our actions are good, and it's good to, recycle properly where you can and put your waste into bins. But I think it's a bigger issue. We need better waste management programs and things like that. So I'm also hoping that we inspire, bigger change.
So when you say waste management, oddly enough, I actually worked at a tip earlier this year for about a month doing some casual work. And I was just there, at the front gate, just letting all these people in. And I actually got a bit of a insight onto, how they sort of measure and how they have to keep measurement of all the waste that comes through. What are the things that we could be doing? Could we be eliminating it by, in terms of type of plastic that we produce? Or is it more of what we do after?
That's really hard.
I know.
Even if we stopped all of plastic production, we would still have plastic entering the ocean for a long, long time. And
it's not just us. It's not just Australia.
And I think you're exactly right. Like, I don't think it's up to just one country and one country's waste management solutions. I think, we need to start uniting as a globe and having some sort of ocean cleanup. I don't know. The answer is really challenging, and I found it hard over the years to sort of answer questions like that because there's just so much and we don't know what to do with it all. And plastic's really difficult to have a solution for. it's designed to be versatile and to be long lasting. So yeah, I don't know, but I would love to see some unity across some of the big players in terms of countries sort of coming together.
So with I think the UN has like a global plastic treaty or something like that. Is that something that sort of like is that the hallmark of what everyone should do, and then everyone sort of tries to get there or goes underneath? Do you know much about?
I can jump in for that one.
Thanks, Hayley.
Yeah, so this is a treaty that's been in the works for quite a few years now, and unfortunately it keeps getting postponed and shut down. So the next sort of get-together of countries is occurring in August. But as Alex mentioned, plastics, they don't follow international borders, so we need an international cooperation strategy to deal with this. At the moment, it's just this patchwork of strategies of each different country, with some countries doing an amazing job and other countries lagging behind. Not necessarily due to a lack of will, but sometimes just due to a lack of resources and being overwhelmed with their waste. So I feel like a global plastics treaty would really promote and create a framework for that international cooperation, and just an organisation that we really need at the moment to just sort of a cohesive plan of how to deal with this international crisis.
Yep. So you touched on something there. Does that mean like who, such a naive question, but who looks after, whose responsibility is the oceans? Like we have our borders, which is the land, then whose responsibility is the ocean, really?
Yeah. And that's where it becomes such an interdisciplinary area as well. So then, the Global Plastics Treaty might be engaged with the High Seas Treaty, which is trying to manage these international waters. So basically ask the question of whose responsibility is it? There's been a couple of theories floated as it should be down to the polluters, so the producers of this plastic, they should be tagged and fined for the amount of plastics waste that they produce. Some people have suggested it should be per country basis. Yeah, it's a really, really difficult question to answer, but that's what we hope this Global Plastics Treaty will kind of untangle.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking that since we have the emissions, couldn't we do something where we have like an emissions-based tax, but for the actual businesses that are producing the plastic? Is that something that is currently in place?
It really depends. Again, really depends on the country and the political will.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, fair enough. So, Alex, what do you think is the biggest thing to drive change for everyone, and for everyone to take some actions and some steps for the community and individuals and local government to reduce the plastic harm, and from your research?
I think,
nice and easy.
well, for me, I'm really inspired by, seeing these birds. They're so incredibly resistant and just really awe-inspiring. And so I'm hoping to sort of bridge the gap between people and, their experience. They're tucked away on remote islands and flying across the ocean, and a lot of people could go their life and not see one of these birds or really see the impacts of plastic on their life. So sort of bridging that gap, because I think if people are inspired by them, they'll be inspired to make change. And also, if they're seeing the impacts, they might be inspired by how, the actions in their life are contributing to that. We see a lot of bottle caps. And, when I first came home from the island, going to the supermarket was really overwhelming for me, because there's a whole aisle just full of bottles and bottle caps.
Yeah.
And so seeing that was really overwhelming. And so I'm hoping that, people can start to connect with things that these birds are, or that are causing harm to these birds, and then sort of start to notice those habits within their life that can.
Yeah, I'd love to get some photos from you guys of your, even if it's like personal stuff that they haven't been published on, things like that, or things that you can share. That would be great to be able to really showcase exactly what we're talking about. Because even though this is making a huge emotional impact on myself, I think it sort of also coincides with, I spend so much time near the water and near the ocean, and you see these birds, flying all the time, and you see all different types of, sea life. We saw I think it was a stingray washed up with my daughter, and she was shattered. She was absolutely shattered. She was like, "We've got to get it back in the water." And I was just like, "Honey, I think it's dead," and that's when something's in front of you, you really pay attention to it. But, if we're in a city, concrete jungle and things like that, it's really easy to separate ourselves from it, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So in terms of your work with the Adrift Lab and other institutions, what's sort of like, how can we empower sort of like grassroots or systematic change? It seems like kids really give a shit these days, because I know my daughter's diligent. They're absolutely diligent with recycle and, you know, you can't put that in there and things like that. They see stuff on the floor, not on the floor, on the ground at the beach, and they just pick it up. They don't care. They pick it up, they put it in the bin and go and wash their hands, and they just don't care. So I think we're doing a really good job in terms of grassroots in a sense.
Yeah.
But what's another systematic change that, you know, that you would think that could be introduced, or something, even if it's a mindset or how we go about making a good change?
Well, I think you've kind of covered it, that us and the generations coming through, you know, we're loud and we're really encouraging change. You know, it's kind of the older generations that are sort of stuck, especially in that political mindset where you've only got like a 4-year term. They're really focused on those 4 years and not really the state of the environment for generations to come. Whereas our generations, you know, we're loud, we want to protect these environments. And so I think starting to listen to the kids and making sure we're supporting them, it's going to take a few years for us to get through.
Yes.
But I guess just, you know, we are loud and we are wanting to make these changes. And so I think supporting that and also fostering it as well is really important.
My daughter actually had an amazing idea, and it was about something else, but I'll pitch it to you guys. So you know how if you serve as a prime minister, or if you get like a wage for the rest of your life. And she was like, do they still get that wage if they do a shit job? I was like, yeah, they do. She goes, so they can do a terrible job for 4 years and get paid for the rest of their lives? I said, yeah. And they said, what if they don't do anything about climate change or anything? I said, well, it's no impact. They still get paid the same. And she was like, they should get dock pay. Like, there should be some sort of like, if these people are going to get paid for the rest of their lives from our taxes, and there is a long-term effect which has an environmental impact on health, or some sort of like effect on environment, then they should get penalized for making such poor decisions and only thinking of that space that you were just talking about, the 4 years. I know that's a drastic thing. That is a very drastic thing.
But I think having some sort of incentives in order to sort of prioritize change, especially in a climate setting, would probably be the most logical step to sort of encourage that movement.
I think the problem, like, I would be all for that, but I guess I am very fortunate to live in a very environmentally conscious bubble to some extent. So I think one action that I feel like we all need to take as scientists and conservationists and, you know, people in storytelling is we need to reach across the divide a little bit and try to engage with people who don't share our mindsets as well. So, for example, as scientists, for a very long time, academia has been locked behind paywalls, and it's sort of sat there, and if nobody can access our science, nobody's going to care about it, because people can only really care about things that they know and understand. So I feel like one other thing that has become really prominent, which I love, is science communication, outreach, getting out there, talking to people, sharing our personal stories, and really trying to connect with people who might not have been able to engage in this space, both politically and in terms of our communities. I feel like that's a really important step that we can take.
Yeah, that's a great idea, because you're absolutely right. Those paywalls kill me sometimes. Like, there's stuff that I want to find out and I just can't find out. So in terms of both of your career journeys, where do you see yourself going with your research, and, what's going to be a natural fit with what's happening? Like, is there a time frame to working with Adrift Lab and what you're doing, and, what's the sort of mindset there afterwards?
I can start. I'm very much tunnel vision for the next few months as I wrap up my PhD. Just feeling very much all-consuming. So it's absolutely my whole world at the moment. It's just focusing on these last few months and finishing up. But I think I have such a unique set of skills in terms of ecology and medical research that, moving forward, I could really be a great asset to sort of any conservation. Because it doesn't even just have to be birds, but start to apply these tools more widely is sort of my big inspiration, and start to bring a bit more awareness around the conservation across the globe.
So how did the work of Rachel Carlson influence your conversation?
Well, growing up, I think I read a lot of really dry science textbooks, and then I came across. Yeah, it was really like, birds or any wildlife is just cool, and so you learn all these fun facts about them, but they can be really dry. And I came across Rachel Carlson, and she's quite emotive in the way that she writes, and it's not the way in which we're taught to write science. You're not taught to sort of write with your heart. You're taught to explain facts and to make and sort of convince people what you're talking about, whereas for her, she was just sort of observing and writing about the beauty of that, and that made me feel really inspired. And so I kind of hope to do the next, where part of what Adrift Lab does is that we share the other side of things. We don't just do research papers. We're talking about our feelings and how it feels to be on the front line of the pollution crisis and working with these birds and the grief that comes with that. So I'm hoping to connect with people more emotionally in order to influence change and to help the conservation of these birds.
Yeah, okay, that's amazing. That's awesome. What about you, Hayley? I mean, your family is like, you're surrounded by it, so it seems like you're just going to keep on going in your path. Or what other aspects do you think you can see yourself researching, and what's the next few years hold for you?
Yeah. So I'm still fairly early in my career. I've only done an honours. I would love to do a PhD at some point. But at the moment, I love wearing a variety of different hats. So I work with the Adrift Lab as a researcher working on plastics, not just seabirds. We've actually got a new paper coming out looking at the impact of plastics on bowerbirds, our lovely terrestrial, colourful friends. Also, part of my work is with another organisation called the Marine Mammal Foundation. So that's also very heavily focused on plastics and sustainability, except instead of looking at seabirds, they focus on our beautiful endemic Byron dolphin, which is only found in southeastern Australia. And my personal connection to that is it was my mum who discovered the species in 2011. I remember her from a very young age bringing me out on the boat and really engaging with the environment and the marine space. But then I also remember she was doing a necropsy, so she was trying to understand why a dolphin had passed away. And she found in its stomach, similar to the seabirds, she found 2 plastic bin bags, like big black bin bags, surrounded by a bunch of parasitic worms. So for me, I love seabirds, I love dolphins, but I want to really see how this plastic issue is infecting all sorts of different, environments and different living things. So not just our charismatic megafauna. I really want to delve into how plastic is affecting the environment as a whole, and I'd love to keep doing that with the Adrift Lab.
Yeah, okay. No, they both sound really, it sounds like you guys are doing all the work that we should be doing. And, I guess if some of us were smarter, then, we would be able to do what you guys are doing, but you guys are doing an amazing job. So we end up wrapping up the podcast with this question. And it's all about, sort of living in a world where, where you're grateful, and because I feel like grateful breeds grateful. So we always ask, what does sort of like abundance mean to you? So I'll ask you, Alex, what's abundance mean to you in your world?
That's a great question. I think anytime I'm like sitting on a difficult question or, just need to really process what's going on, I get knee deep in whatever ecosystem I'm craving. And I think just sitting in the abundance of biodiversity and the beautiful world that we live in, like I feel really connected to that and then motivated and find clarity, but then also surrounding myself with like-minded people. I've been incredibly fortunate to work with the Adrift Lab, and where we are really open about what's going on. And so there's abundance and richness in being able to sort of relate to the team and share what we're going through. And I've really been inspired by that, especially by Jen leading this lab, because there are other lab heads that aren't as connected to their students or other researchers within the lab. And so awesome.
Thanks, Alex. That was beautiful. Hayley, what does abundance mean to you?
Usually I would say pretty much exactly what Alex says. Absolutely getting out in the environment, getting inspired. To take a slightly different tack for me, I think we can put abundance in the context of you were asking about what we can do to take action and take change. We live in a society where we have an abundance of choice for the most part. We come from a very lucky country where we have an abundance of resources. So on a personal level, taking that abundance and being able to do something with it. So going back to basics of, you know, you have your reduce, reuse, recycle, repurpose, repair, all of those re's. But we also, because of that abundance, we have the choice to rethink our actions. So we have, you know, at the supermarket, you have a bag of apples in plastic, or you have loose apples. You know, we have the abundance of choice to be able to rethink our behavior and say, hey, if I can avoid using a single-use plastic, I'm going to choose the one where I can make less of an impact. Or at a government level, we come from a fairly rich country. We have an abundance of resources. The government has the ability to provide financial incentives for greener opportunities and ensure that our council waste systems are funded. So I think, reminding ourselves of the beauty and the abundance of our natural world and the lovely, you know, species that call home, but recognizing that we have an abundance of choice as well to take action to protect these species.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love it. Thank you so much, girls. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. This has been amazing. This has been absolutely eye-opening for me. If you did want to get in touch, available at the adriftlab.org. Girls, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having us. They're great questions.
Yeah, your research is amazing, and it's really insightful.